A homeless man was escorted into the courtroom, facing charges for loitering and causing a public disturbance. He didn't have a lawyer and offered no defense, just sat quietly, staring off into the distance with vacant eyes. The judge flipped through his file, pausing abruptly. "Your name is," she began, but the words caught in her throat. How could a simple name bring an entire courtroom to a standstill, silent as if mourning? "Welcome to QH. Let's dig into what really happened." Edward J. Morgan had become a familiar sight in downtown Chicago over the past 15 years. Around 75 years old, his once sturdy frame had withered with time and hardship. His long, scraggly white hair poked out from beneath a faded military cap, now barely showing its original color. A battered, oversized army jacket hung loosely from his thin shoulders, looking more like a relic from another era than clothing. Every day, no matter the weather, Edward settled onto the same worn bench outside the public library. Unlike some homeless individuals who begged or caused a stir, Edward carried himself with a quiet dignity. He never asked for a handout, never bothered a soul. Instead, he sat in silence, occasionally scribbling in a battered notebook with a worn-down pencil he kept tucked behind his ear. The library staff had long since grown used to seeing him there. Some would offer a friendly nod, others would quietly leave a cup of coffee nearby, especially on the colder mornings. A few sharp-eyed workers noticed how he sometimes picked up books left on the outdoor return cart, carefully scanning each page before placing it neatly back. One Tuesday in late January, the city awoke under a light blanket of snow. Temperatures had plummeted overnight, leaving the sidewalks slick and dangerous. Edward showed up at his usual spot, brushed the snow from the bench with a slow sweep of his hand, and sat down. After a while, maybe just to keep warm, he began to hum softly, an old military cadence from days long past. A newly hired security guard noticed him and grew uneasy, worrying that Edward's presence might drive patrons away. When Edward's humming continued, the guard decided to call the police, reporting a vagrant creating a disturbance outside. 2 officers arrived on the scene. Officer Davis, still green with only 6 months on the force, approached with caution. "Sir, we've received some complaints about loitering and making noise. I'm going to need to see some ID." Edward lifted his head slowly, his lined face giving away no emotion. Without speaking, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered plastic card, so worn it was almost unreadable. "This isn't valid ID, sir," Davis said, eyeing it doubtfully. "Do you have anything else?" Edward simply shook his head, offering no further explanation. "Sir, I'm afraid you can't remain here. City ordinances don't allow loitering in public spaces," Davis added, shifting awkwardly under the weight of Edward's silence. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Without a word of protest, Edward carefully closed his little notebook, tucked it inside his jacket, and rose to his feet. The officers, bracing for potential resistance, were visibly surprised by how willingly he complied as they walked him to the patrol car. At the station, Edward was processed like so many other homeless people had been that week, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a court date for the next morning. No one thought to ask about the army jacket he wore or the set of dog tags hidden beneath his layers of clothing. In the holding cell that night, Edward sat perfectly still on the bench, his gaze locked on some far-off point no one else could see. By morning, the municipal courtroom buzzed with the usual crowd, minor offenders brought in for public drunkenness, shoplifting, traffic violations, and a handful of homeless individuals facing nuisance charges. Edward's case was slated to be the last one heard. Judge Eleanor Clark presided with her typical brisk efficiency. At 61, she was a veteran of the bench, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her reputation for being fair, if firm. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back tightly, and her serious expression, framed by reading glasses, rarely wavered. The courtroom itself was stuffy, filled with the constant shuffle of papers and low murmurs of conversation. In the gallery, a young legal intern named Sofia Alvarez sat observing, diligently taking notes for her law school practicum. When Edward's name was called, he didn't respond. The bailiff had to approach and gently tap him on the shoulder. "They're calling you, sir." Moving stiffly, no doubt from arthritis and the chill of the holding cell, Edward slowly rose to his feet. Several people in the courtroom wrinkled their noses as the smell of days-old clothing wafted through the room. If Edward noticed the stares or the judgment, he gave no sign. Judge Clark picked up his case file, not even glancing up at first. Case number 47293, Commonwealth vs. She began, but then her voice faltered. She stared at the name on the page, her face draining of color. "Your name is Edward J. Morgan," she asked, her normally unwavering voice suddenly fragile. A heavy silence fell over the room. When everyone turns their back, a narrator's voice echoed, "Only conscience remains." Want to know what happened next? Judge Eleanor Clark was not known for showing emotion from the bench. In her 20-plus years of service, she had learned that keeping her distance was essential to delivering justice without bias. But staring now at the frail man before her, something deep inside her cracked. "Mr. Morgan," she finally said, after composing herself, her voice noticeably softer than at any point during the morning's proceedings, "did you serve in the military?" Edward's vacant eyes seemed to sharpen slightly when the question hit him. "Yes, ma'am," he rasped, his voice rough and brittle from years of disuse. "And where did you serve?" Judge Clark asked gently, pushing the case file aside without a second thought. "Alpha Company, 17th Special Forces Group, Pleiku Province, Vietnam," Edward responded in a flat, mechanical tone, as if reciting something he had been taught to remember even as other memories had faded away. An uneasy silence blanketed the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been half asleep through what he thought would be another routine day, snapped upright in his chair, suddenly paying full attention. Judge Clark slipped her hand into her robe pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped carefully in clear plastic, a medallion worn smooth by decades of handling. She stared at it for a long moment before speaking again. "Mr. Hayes," she said slowly, "when I was a child, a soldier from that very unit saved my life. He carried me 3 kilometers to safety during a mortar attack. I never knew who he was, but I've kept his unit medallion ever since." Sensing something extraordinary was unfolding, the court clerk quickly began tapping on his computer, pulling up additional information. "Your Honor," the clerk called out, "our records confirm he is Edward Lawrence Hayes, Staff Sergeant, honorably discharged in 1983. Sophia Alvarez, the young interne, hesitated for just a second before raising her hand. When Judge Clark gave her a nod, she stood and spoke. "Your Honor, if I may, during my pre-law veterans advocacy course, I learned how to access military service databases. According to the records, Mr. Hayes was awarded both the Silver Star and the Purple Heart. The Silver Star was for leading a wounded extraction under heavy fire, and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained while shielding his fellow soldiers during an ambush." Judge Clark took off her glasses then, revealing eyes misted with unexpected emotion. "When I was 8, she said quietly, my family was caught in crossfire while visiting relatives at a medical outpost near the Vietnamese border. In the chaos, I got separated from my parents. A soldier found me hiding in a drainage ditch, terrified out of my mind." She paused, visibly struggling to steady herself before continuing. "That soldier carried me through active combat zones until we reached safety. Before he left, he gave me this medallion, and told me to stay brave. 2 days later, my parents found me at a field hospital. I never learned his name, only that he was part of Special Forces. But I remember his eyes." Judge Clark stared intently at Edward, searching for something familiar. "And those same eyes," she said softly, "are staring back at me right now." Edward's weathered face barely changed, but somewhere deep behind his gaze, something flickered, a spark of recognition, fragile but real. The judge leaned in slightly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you remember Cam Ranh Bay, 1968? A little girl, lost and separated from her family?" Edward's brow furrowed deeply as he struggled to summon the memory. "Many children," he said after a pause, his voice distant. We tried to help them all. Near the defense table, the young officer who had arrested Edward shifted uneasily. He leaned closer to his partner and whispered, "Did we just arrest a war hero?" Meanwhile, Sophia, her fingers flying across her tablet, continued to dig through Edward's military records. "Your Honor, there's even more," she called out. After returning from Vietnam, Mr. Hayes served as a training officer until he left the military. And according to Veterans Affairs records, he worked as an interstate bus driver for nearly 10 years after that. Judge Clark, still visibly moved, asked quietly, "What happened after that?" She directed the question to no one in particular, letting it hang heavily in the air. Sophia scrolled further through the database, her face growing grim. "There's a major gap after 1994, she said. "It looks like he was involved in a serious bus accident. Another vehicle collided with his bus. Medical notes show he suffered significant head trauma, resulting in memory problems, especially with short-term recall, and difficulties handling complex tasks." A court officer who had been standing quietly near the back, an older man with a Vietnam veteran's badge on his uniform, stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may," he said respectfully. "A lot of vets from that era had trouble with paperwork getting lost or mishandled. If Mr. Hayes had memory issues, he might not have been able to keep up with the VA system. He could have easily fallen through the cracks." Throughout this entire conversation, Edward remained silently standing, occasionally nodding ever so slightly, as if confirming bits and pieces he could only partially retrieve from his broken memory. Judge Clark turned her full attention back to him. "Mr. Hayes," she asked gently, "is there any family we can contact for you?" Edward shook his head slowly. "They're gone now," he said simply, the finality of the words needing no further explanation. Realizing just how drastically the situation had shifted, the prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "given the extraordinary circumstances we've just uncovered, the Commonwealth respectfully requests a continuance to reassess the charges against Mr. Hayes." Judge Clark gave a small nod before making a groundbreaking announcement. "This court is suspending proceedings against Mr. Hayes effective immediately. He has no place sitting in the defendant's chair." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The officer who had arrested Edward stared down at his shoes, his face burning with sudden discomfort. "And furthermore," Judge Clark continued firmly, "I am officially recusing myself from this case due to the clear personal connection between myself and the defendant." But before she stepped away, she did something unprecedented, something no one in that courtroom had ever witnessed. Judge Clark descended from the bench mid-session and walked slowly toward Edward. Standing in front of him, her usually composed figure seemed smaller somehow, more human, more vulnerable. "I never really had the chance to thank you," she said, her professional mask slipping away. "The medallion you gave me. I carried it through law school, through the long nights of my early career, and even onto this bench. Whenever I faced a case that seemed impossible, I'd hold it and remind myself what true courage really looks like." Edward stared at her, and for a fleeting moment, recognition stirred behind his weathered features. His hand moved slowly upward, not quite reaching his forehead, but the gesture was unmistakable, a ghost of a salute. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the worn truth of countless years and battles. "No one gets left behind. I don't know about you, but that part really struck a chord with me. Type respect if it moved you too." Judge Clark wasted no time. She called for a 30-minute recess and turned to her clerk with urgent instructions. "Get the Department of Veterans Affairs Emergency Response Team on the phone. Tell them we have a priority case involving a decorated Vietnam veteran. Also, find me someone from the Veterans Legal Aid Society immediately." As the courtroom emptied in stunned silence, Clark personally escorted Edward to her chambers, another shocking break from courtroom protocol that left the court officers exchanging bewildered glances. Sophia, the young intern, was also invited to join them. "You seem to have a good handle on the military databases," Clark explained briefly. "We're going to need that. Inside the judge's chambers, all formalities were abandoned. Clark poured Edward a cup of coffee, which he accepted but didn't drink, his hands shaking slightly from more than just age. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, her voice softened by genuine concern, "I'm going to help you. But first, I need to understand, what happened after your accident? How did someone like you end up homeless?" Edward's answer came slowly, fragmented by the broken pathways of his memory. "The headache started, couldn't stay focused behind the wheel, lost my commercial license, then the apartment." He gestured vaguely, the timeline of his life slipping out of order even as he tried to piece it together. Sophia, typing furiously on her tablet, suddenly looked up. "I think I found something, Your Honor," she said. According to VA records, Mr. Hayes was receiving disability benefits until 1997. Then, the payments just stopped. There's a note about failure to respond to certification requests and returned mail marked recipient unknown. Bureaucratic black hole, Clark muttered grimly. If he couldn't remember to update his address or respond to their paperwork, Sophia added, he would have disappeared from the system completely. Meanwhile, outside the judge's chambers, word was spreading like wildfire. A court reporter who had witnessed the extraordinary scene earlier dashed off a tip to his editor. Judge halts trial after recognizing homeless defendant as war hero. Within hours, the story exploded across local news outlets. By nightfall, national headlines blared with variations of the same remarkable revelation. Judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved her life. When the court reconvened later that day, the gallery was packed to the brim with reporters, veterans, and curious citizens. Judge Clark had changed into her ceremonial robe, one she usually reserved only for the most solemn of occasions. She wasn't alone at the bench now, two representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs flanked her, along with a distinguished silver-haired man in a meticulously tailored suit, introduced as Colonel William Prescott, retired, now working with the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. Before diving into the legal matters, Clark addressed the courtroom. "Before we proceed," she said clearly, "I wish to enter a statement into the official record. Today's proceedings have uncovered facts of immense importance regarding the defendant, Edward Lawrence Hayes." She gestured respectfully to Colonel Prescott, who stepped forward to speak. After a thorough review of classified and declassified materials, Prescott began, his voice steady, "We can confirm that Staff Sergeant Hayes was part of a top-secret operation, codenamed Rising Fog, back in 1971. This mission involved rescuing American POWs from a prison camp just across the Laotian border. The operation remained classified until 2008, meaning Mr. Hayes was legally barred from speaking about his service for most of his life." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the crowded courtroom. Judge Clark continued without missing a beat. "In addition," she said, "our preliminary findings confirm that after suffering a traumatic brain injury in 1994, Mr. Hayes endured severe memory impairment. It's highly likely that these cognitive difficulties prevented him from managing the bureaucratic hurdles necessary to retain his benefits and his home." Finally grasping the full weight of the situation, the prosecutor stood solemnly. "Your Honor, given these truly extraordinary circumstances," he said, "the Commonwealth respectfully moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes, with prejudice." "So ordered," Judge Clark responded without hesitation. But this court's duty doesn't end at dismissing the charges. A grave injustice has been done, not by one person, but by a system that failed to recognize and support a man who sacrificed everything for his country. Two VA representatives stepped forward, carrying a folder thick with documents. "We've already begun emergency reinstatement procedures for Mr. Hayes's benefits," one explained. "While it will take time to process back payments, we've approved immediate housing and medical assistance." As these announcements rippled through the courtroom, news of the story exploded across social media. The hashtag Honor Hayes began trending nationwide, with thousands expressing outrage that a decorated veteran had ended up homeless, and worse, criminalized. Veterans groups mobilized with astonishing speed. By the afternoon, representatives from 3 major organizations had arrived at the courthouse, each eager to offer Edward housing, medical care, and legal support to fully restore his life. One of the most emotional moments came when a group of active duty service members, in Chicago for training, showed up at the courthouse. In full uniform, they stood at rigid attention outside, a silent but powerful display of respect. Inside, Judge Clark made a decision unlike any she'd made in her career. "This court will convene a special recognition session tomorrow at 9 a.m., she declared. "Although I am officially recused from Mr. Hayes's case, I will preside over this session as a private citizen, and as someone whose life he once saved." That evening, instead of being sent back to a shelter, Edward was escorted to a private room at the VA Medical Center. Doctors immediately began comprehensive evaluations of his physical and cognitive health. The initial reports were cautiously hopeful. While some of Edward's memory loss seemed permanent, specialists believed targeted therapy might help him recover more fragments of his past, and improve his quality of life. Later that night, after finishing her court business, Judge Clark paid Edward a visit at the hospital. In her hand was the small medallion that had connected their lives so many years ago. "Do you remember giving this to me?" she asked, placing it gently into his palm. Edward turned it over carefully, studying it like a lost relic. "Sometimes things come back in pieces," he said, his voice slow but certain. "A village burning, a little girl hiding in a culvert, so many frightened faces." Clark nodded softly. "That little girl was me," she said. "You told me to be brave. You said help was coming. And then you carried me to safety." "Just doing my job," Edward repeated quietly, a phrase that seemed both sincere and a familiar place to retreat when his mind grew foggy. "Your job saved my life," Clark replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And now, maybe, I can help save yours." The next morning, the courthouse saw a scene unlike any it had ever witnessed. The special session Judge Clark had announced drew hundreds, veterans, active service members, news crews, and everyday citizens who had been touched by Edward's story. Clark, now dressed in formal civilian clothes instead of judicial robes, stood behind the podium. In her hands was something precious, a complete set of documents restoring Edward's identity. His birth certificate, a new social security card, a military ID, and a Veterans Affairs identification, painstakingly prepared by a team that had worked through the night. "Mr. Hayes," Clark said formally, her voice carrying across the packed room. "On behalf of a grateful nation, and a particularly grateful little girl who survived because of your courage, I return to you your identity and your honor. Though the truth is, you never truly lost it." Edward, now wearing clean clothes provided by a veterans group, stepped forward to accept the documents. His hand still trembled slightly, but the old military bearing returned, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and for a moment, the proud young soldier he once was shone through. Then something even more extraordinary happened. Judge Eleanor Clark removed her ceremonial robe, stepped away from the podium, and approached Edward with her hand extended. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," she said, her voice steady with emotion, "I could never sit in judgment of the man who saved my life." The ripple effect from the session was immediate and profound. By the end of the day, the Chicago City Council had announced a full review of how homeless veterans were handled by the legal system. The mayor's office issued a new directive requiring that all homeless individuals arrested for minor offenses be checked for prior military service before charges were processed. But the most meaningful outcome came from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They unveiled a sweeping new initiative, Operation Hayes, designed to find and support veterans suffering from cognitive impairments who had been lost in the bureaucratic cracks. As Edward prepared to leave the courthouse, now surrounded by a small army of supporters, a reporter called out, "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to finally be recognized after all these years?" Edward paused, the gears in his mind turning slowly but surely. At last, he answered with simple, unshakable dignity. "I never came back looking for parades. Just a quiet place to remember my brothers who didn't make it home. Now, maybe, I can finally remember them the way they deserve." Has someone from your past ever reappeared when you least expected it? Tell us about that moment of recognition. 6 months after that unforgettable day, Edward Hayes settled into a modest but warm apartment in a supportive veterans housing complex. The once bare walls of his new home were soon covered with framed photos, certificates, and memories, pieces of a life of service that nearly slipped through history's cracks. Each morning, Edward would sit at a small desk by the window, writing diligently in a handsome leather-bound journal, a gift from Judge Clark. His doctors had recommended journaling as therapy, helping him anchor fading memories and protect the fragments that remained. Those writings, snapshots of a soldier's life, a civilian's journey, and the hard-fought battles afterward, were eventually added to the National Veterans History Project archive. The bench outside the Chicago Public Library, once just another anonymous resting place, now bore a plaque. Staff Sergeant Edward J. Morgan, and all veterans whose service must never be forgotten. The library also launched a veterans outreach program, ensuring that anyone who needed help would find resources, and respect. Meanwhile, the very courtroom where Clark had first recognized Edward was renamed Hayes Chamber, where justice bows to courage. It was now a specialized courtroom for veterans' cases, complete with trained advocates at every proceeding. Sophia Alvarez, the once nervous law student who had helped uncover Edward's history, found her calling. After graduation, she joined the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, dedicating her career to assisting veterans suffering from traumatic brain injuries. When welcoming new interns, Sophia often began with Edward's story. "We don't judge people," she said. "We judge our incomplete understanding of them." Judge Clark remained a fixture in Edward's life, meeting him for coffee every other Sunday. Sometimes they talked, other times they simply sat in the kind of comfortable silence that speaks volumes between two people who know the cost of survival. Occasionally, Clark would bring historical photographs from the Vietnam archives, hoping to help Edward reclaim even more pieces of himself. On the anniversary of their extraordinary reunion, local veterans organized a small, heartfelt ceremony. When Edward was asked to speak, he approached the microphone slowly, thoughtfully. Looking out over the gathered crowd, he said, "A person's name is sometimes an entire history we haven't yet learned." The room hushed, the weight of his words settling deeply into every heart. "Heroes aren't always standing on pedestals," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sometimes they're sitting quietly in a defendant's chair, forgotten by the very world they helped protect." Judge Clark, seated proudly in the front row, nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Edward's final words that day echoed through the hall with quiet strength. "Listen before judging, because the silence of someone who has endured can speak louder than any defense." Those words, his words, were later engraved at the entrance to the Veterans Justice Center named in his honor. Behind every name lies a story. Behind every silence lies a sacrifice. Within every judgment should first come understanding. Justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly denied. Don't lose heart when you're standing for what's right. What moment have you stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to Uncovered Tales to see how truth and justice still prevail. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is always worth it. We told their story. You gave it meaning. Thank you.